Hello, my name is Matt Corral. I'm the design director for a company called Ultraleap. We work with VR and mid-air haptics and hand tracking. And I've been a digital or user experience designer for many years. And this is video 4 of a series of 5 about the UX design process. So if you haven't seen the ones prior to this, go back and have a look at them first and come back to this one and it'll make more sense. In this one, we're going to talk about stage 3, which is called refine. Prior to this, we have just run a workshop where we've come up with a wide range of ideas for how we can solve our user's problem. And we've whittled them down to the one winning idea, which we probably have as a rough sketch or a storyboard. Now in the refine phase, this is about the designers. It's primarily a design-led activity, though your colleagues will be involved a bit too. This will be about the designers putting their heads down and really practicing their craft. So from that rough starting point, really trying to figure out everything that this digital product needs to do. So let's say it was a website or an app. You'll be thinking, what are all the screens? What are all the features? How do people experience it? In what kind of order? You might be starting to sketch layouts of screens, choosing UI components, thinking about the visual style, usability, accessibility, all the things that you need to consider that is part of your craft. And by the end of this stage, you'll be able to move into code. So your colleagues in software development will be able to start building the thing. Doesn't mean that you've got to finish the design in this phase, just means you've got to get it to a point where most stuff is roughly figured out. Let's talk about some of the common activities. So mapping is definitely one of the first things you're going to do. Mapping is a bit of a broad term. It probably means you're going to be putting some post-it notes on the wall, or you'll be using a digital equivalent. There's a tool called Miro that I really like for doing this. And there are many different names and different flavors and kinds of these maps, but broadly speaking, they're all kind of similar. You're going to use post-it notes to describe all the things users can do, probably going from left to right, and effectively describe the scope of your digital product by describing everything that customers need to do. Yeah, you're probably describing features and screens, but you need to be able to say that every feature and every screen does something for a customer. So you need to be able, again, to point back to your persona and say how all the features will help. This will become one of your central references. So in doing that mapping, you are effectively describing everything in the product, and it's something that will evolve over time as you evolve the design, but you'll probably start it here. The other thing you'll be doing is UI mockups. So you need to start bringing this stuff to life. I recommend you start with pen and paper. You'll be sketching out screens, UI components, or at least some of the most important stuff, and describing how people use them. People do start in Photoshop or Sketch sometimes, but I strongly recommend you guys to start with pen and paper. It's going to be quicker. Your ideas are going to flow more freely. You're not going to be constrained by the tool. You can move into Photoshop and Sketch a little later when things are a bit more roughly worked out. But here, you're starting to bring it to life rather than sweating every last detail. Beyond this, you might then move into an interactive prototype, and that might be using a bit of software called Axure or InVision or Figma, Framer. There are absolutely loads of these tools and new ones popping up all the time. Key point is that it's slower to build an interactive prototype. So we don't start with that. We start fast with pen and paper. We might then move to some UI mockups in Sketch or Photoshop. Then when we're starting to get our head around how most of this works, then we might make it interactive. It's just a slightly more time-consuming thing to do. The reason we do that is kind of twofold. One, as a designer, it enables you to get a feel for what it's like to use it, to click through menus and buttons and screens, but also to hand it to someone else so that they can start to get it, which is where we're going to get into user testing in a minute. So that prototype is really, as a designer, probably about as far as you can go by building something where you can get a feel for the end product. Just bear in mind that it takes a few days to build, so you don't want to do it right at the start. User testing is, again, another thing that you're going to learn to do as part of your skill set. It's really good practice to get something in front of customers absolutely as soon as you can. And you don't really need to build something particularly polished or detailed to do it. I've even done it just with paper sketches sometimes. But if you can make an interactive prototype of at least, a few key screens or a few parts of your product, you get a lot more feedback from people because it'll be a bit more like a real thing. It'll be easier for them to imagine what it would be like using it. This is a really useful thing to do because it's a reality check. It enables you to get a preview of what it would be like putting your design into the real world and letting real people use it. Bear in mind that, when we first met our users back in Define and we went and interviewed them, we were learning about their problem. And when you come back, you might even be the same people you go see. You will be showing them your first idea for this thing. And a lot of time has passed. So you really want to check that you're on the right path and that the design idea you're following has promise. This will be your first kind of reality check of that. And it might well be that you'll learn you got a bunch of stuff wrong and you need to make some changes. But at this early stage of the process, those changes are cheap and quick, because all you might need to do is change a sketch or change your prototype in Action, which doesn't take very long. Whereas if we leave usability testing till much later in the process, when we've written a lot of code and built a lot of product, those changes are a bigger deal and they take more time and they're kind of more expensive to do. So we do testing early and we do it 2 or 3 times throughout the process, because the earlier we can learn what we got wrong, the quicker it is for us to fix it, Other things you might well be doing is you're going to be doing, reviews with stakeholders will be really common. So I said you've got your head down and, it's worth saying that designers will need a bit of dedicated time to really think and focus on this stuff. So, expect to have chunks of time where you really are being kind of left to do it. You're not having to report back what your work every single day. But that feedback to your team will need to happen. So it might be common that, say, once a week or something, you set up a review. It might be a check-in with your boss, with your client, where you show your latest design. You can reassure them because they can see progress and see how things are evolving. But it's also good for you. You'll be getting feedback from them on things that should change for business or things we should change for technical constraints and that kind of thing. In the first video, you remember kind of seeing a looping diagram, and this is really the kind of thing it's describing. You might work for a week on the design and then every week kind of check it with people and get some feedback and kind of iterate a bit more. You want to keep the software development team engaged and involved here. We'll get more into that in the next stage, but as soon as there's something to show, you want to be sharing it with your development teams just so that they're aware of how the scope of this product is evolving and getting a sense of what they're going to have to code up ahead, because they'll be able to help and advise you early on. Big thing for me, particularly when I started out, was just not knowing what was technically possible. And I can chat to the development team as I'm sketching or prototyping and get their advice. So I do recommend getting to know those guys and getting them involved early. The final thing you probably have to do is presentations. So yeah, you'll be reviewing the design, but at some point you're going to have to stand up in front of a room of people, show your prototype and explain why it is the way it is and answer their questions. Why did you put that button there? Why why does the menu work that way? Why not this way? It's really nerve-wracking at first, but I promise it gets much easier, much more quickly than you might think, The thing to remember is just to always be thinking about the reason for your decisions. So as you're working on that design, have a good reason why you think something is right. Maybe you've tried it out and you can find that menu feels really easy to use, or maybe the competitor product uses it. Or maybe, you learned in the define stage that this is something that customers are quite used to using, so you're putting it in. Just always be prepared to answer questions with a reason why the design is the way it is. And again, it gets easier over time. It'll be really helped by having clear personas and clear info from the define stage. So like I said earlier, if the define stage has gone really well and you've gathered good info, then it'll be easier to explain why your design decisions help your user. It kind of makes everything down the line trickle down a bit. But just know that those presentations are coming, and just know that you'll need to be able to explain back up and explain your design decisions. And don't worry too much. It'll get easier with practice, and it terrified me the first few years as well. But yeah, it's all good. It's all part of learning the skill set. So the refine stage is probably one of the longest ones. It could be anything from a few weeks to a few months typically. And by the time you get to the end of it, you should not have finished the design. That's not how this works. If you think you're finished, you're wrong. But you should have figured out most of the broad strokes. You know, you should know roughly what the screens are. You should know all the key features. You should have chosen, you know, sketched or prototyped the most important parts that users will use most often. And all going well, you'll have gone and run a user test where you've had feedback, and either it will have gone great or it didn't go great and you learn what you had to change. But you should now have your map and you should now have your interactive prototype, and between them they will describe the design. The map shows the full scope of everything in it. The prototype gives people a feel for how it is to use it, and you've got a user test that kind of says, yep, this stuff is looking pretty good. At this point, we can move into actually coding, and we can do it with a real degree of confidence, which is what we're going to get to next in the build phase.